I am going to start from slide number 3, which will give you an overview of who I am and what this session is about. I'm peer review innovation lead at Elsevier. I joined Elsevier 10 years ago. I'm a physicist by education and started my role in Elsevier as an internal managing editor and then eventually moved to the role I have now. Today, I'm going to talk to you about peer review. So starting with the basics, what is peer review, how the community thinks about peer review, and what are different peer review models. And then hopefully we will have enough time to give you a flavor of how as an editor you can find good and willing reviewers, and then as a reviewer, write a good peer review comment. And then I will summarize and finish by inviting you all to get involved. So what is peer review? The peer review is the process of validation of an academic work for making sure that it's improving the quality of the paper, ensuring the previous work is acknowledged, determining the importance of the findings, assessing the originality and the significance of the work, and also highlighting any omissions of the reference list, as well as any ethical concerns. Peer review includes internal journal editorial staff and editorial offices, as well as external researchers, and cannot be complete without having both in place. I'm going to share with you some of the survey results that we run rather frequently. Specifically about peer review, we ran a survey across the globe for researchers to understand what do they think about peer review and their level of trust in peer review. And then reran the survey 10 years after in 2019. The link to the survey is also available on the slides. You will have it later. I'm going to give you a flavor of it. When we asked, please extend to which statement you agree or disagree, it seems that peer review, everyone agrees that is there to improve the quality of research as a whole. People in the research community believe that it takes a reasonable time from them to review an article, and they believe that it is well understood among the research community, but unfortunately, the public doesn't really know what peer review is, and I think the pandemic showed that quite clearly to everyone. And it is also interesting to see that the research community believes that without peer review, there is no control in scientific communication, and also the majority thinks that not only the manuscript, the narrative of the research, but also the research elements such as the data and supporting material that accompany the manuscript should also be validated. When we asked how do they define peer review, as I mentioned also at the beginning of our session, the majority believes that peer review cannot be complete without having an external researcher to criticize the paper. So member of the editorial team and 2 relevant researchers, 2, I emphasize, are being considered as the norm for a process to be called and qualified as peer review. And in 2019, many believed machines and artificial intelligence would not justify peer review. And I think this is still the sentiment. When we ask them what would maintain the health of the peer review process and the quality of the peer review process, the top 5 items the community rated were providing a clear guidance to reviewers on criteria for reviewing, employee recognition of the time and effort, so not necessarily journal, but institutions and funders. Transparency of the reviewer comments to authors. Diversity, a greater diversity of the reviewer pool of a journal, and a clear formal training that creates a kind of quality benchmark. So I'm going to tell you also a little bit about different peer review models. I'm sure you know and have been working with one or two of that, but historically every journal is running either under single, double, triple anonymized peer review, formerly known as blind peer review, or since recently open peer review. But since different journals have different ways of introducing and defining their peer review models, to provide a greater consistency and to enable journals to demonstrate integrity in their peer review process, STM organization created a peer review taxonomy in 2020, and I had the honor to represent Elsevier in that working group. And it is then got adopted by STM and NISO. And since a month ago, 2 months ago, it has become a standard. So you can find the link in this slide to the standard, but I'm going to also show you how the standard looks like. And many publishers and the societies and associations have adopted the peer review terminology standards. The first thing that might sound a little bit weird to you is that we are not using the terminology blind, because obviously no one is blind. People identity get anonymized for different reasons in different peer review models. So we are moving away from the ableist terminology and using anonymized. The first category in the peer review models is identity transparency. So when all identities are visible, the editor, the reviewer, and author identity, it's identity, all identities transparent. When we talk about single anonymized, it's when the journal uses the model where reviewers know who the authors are, but authors don't know who their reviewers are. This is quite common in physical sciences, for example, and it is meant to protect the reviewers from being retaliated by authors. Double anonymized model is when neither reviewers know nor authors know about each other's identity. It's meant to provide a fairer peer review process to authors, but it's really difficult to thoroughly anonymize a paper and all these supplementary files and documentations, not to mention the self-citations. It is a common practice in social sciences, in many disciplines. Triple anonymized is when the decision-making editor doesn't know the reviewer and author identities. So another editor chooses the reviewers for a manuscript, but then all the reviewer comments and the manuscript lands on the decision-making editor, who doesn't know anything about the identities of the authors and reviewers. And it is meant to also remove editor bias, which is not tackled in the double anonymized model. Then apart from the identities, we can think about interaction between different parts involved in the peer review process. So it can be that everyone only interacts with editor. It can be that reviewers can interact among themselves, similar to what eLife used to have. And it can be that reviewers can interact with authors directly. It's like what happens in Frontiers somehow. Another aspect in the peer review models is the information about the reviewer comment. So it can be that nothing is published when the article is published about the peer review comments. It can be that the review summaries is published. I know a couple of self-press journals are doing that, where the editor summarizes entire reviewer comments and publishes them along with the accepted article. It can be that the full-length review reports get published, depending on authors giving consent or reviewers giving consent. It can be that the entire communication between author, reviewers, and editors gets published, not only the reviewer comments. And it can the editor name is published on the article page as well as the handling editor of the paper. And then obviously there is the post-publication information that can be or cannot be made available. Now, let's also talk about the peer review process itself, regardless of the model. Usually it happens as soon as the authors submit their manuscript to a journal. The first thing that the editors do internally is to screen the paper. They check whether the manuscript is within the aims and scope, if there is no ethical concern, and then in that case, when it passes through the first kind of screening, checking for the writing quality, the logical flow of the ideas, novelty of the topics, the editor decides to either reject the paper or send it to 2 reviewers. And then the reviewers make their comments, submit it to the editor. The editor reads and decide based on reviewer comments whether to suggest further revision to authors or accept as is or reject it. So as an editor, when you're trying to find reviewers, it's important to remind yourselves that the goal is to select experts in the topic with no or minimum, at least, conflicts of interest. But if there is not a possibility of find experts in the topic itself, it is important to check the methods and find at least experts who are familiar with the methods. The best practice, as I mentioned, is to have 2 independent experts reviewing the manuscript. Many editors maintain a database that basically gives an overview of who might be a good candidate. But knowing you have access to Scopus, I think it's a good idea to also use the Scopus keyword searching on Scopus for manuscript to find good candidates beyond the known reviewers in your network. Another way of expanding reviewer pool is to make sure that you engage with the recently accepted authors of the journal, because those are the people who have experienced the peer review model, the peer review process of your journal, know well what the journal is looking for, and they would also want to give back the service that the journal provided. Editorial board members are another resource. Make sure that when you have an editorial board and have contracts with them, you make sure that they are also obliged to participate in the peer review process. At any rate, it is important to provide clear guidance to the reviewers. It can be that you introduce those guidance as structured way of doing peer review. We have a series of journals that use a structured peer review, and in those cases, questions are publicly available. Make sure that you check the link, and if you're interested in adopting them, feel free to adopt them verbatim or change them per the needs of the journal. And make sure that you communicate directly and quite clearly about the criteria that the journal wants from a good review. As we saw in the survey, this is what the community wants from journals. And make sure that you give a reasonable deadline. Check you have good reminders with good sequences in place to remind reviewers of timely submission. So editors appreciate alternative suggestions if reviewers decline the invitation. So if you're a reviewer and don't have the time to review, make sure you introduce someone who can review to the editor. Sometimes reviewers agree, but produce nothing, or they don't respond to reminders. I think it is an important thing that was mentioned in the previous presentation as well. So one of the reasons you don't see any progress in your manuscript is probably the delay that the reviewers are causing. So it is important to return with the review report timely. These are a few examples that I took from actual review reports submitted to our journals that I'd like to share. This is what the editor doesn't want to receive, like a one-sentence good paper, but not very original. Or rather, sentences but useless. Interesting letter. The third sentence in first paragraph needs at least another word, perhaps change. Apostrophe like to deal with some aspects, so close quote, and this is not going to help the editor to make a decision. So as a good reviewer, you need to be accurate, provide an in-depth overview of the manuscript with your own thoughts and input. Make sure that the paper is appropriate for the journal and the community that reads the journal. Make sure that the quality and clarity of the writing is within the standards. The flow of ideas is good enough to understand what the authors are going to achieve. The literature review is up to date and adequate. The methods are appropriate. The statistics and the data displayed are appropriate. Conclusions are supported by the data, and there is enough evidence to ensure that there is no ethical concerns. When those review comments come to the journal, the editor usually screens for the tone of the review, because those are the comments that authors will read. So it is important to make sure that the tone is constructive, the tone is friendly. It can be that for harsh and unprofessional, condescending comments, the editors might edit those comments or simply remove them in their decision letter to authors. And then they make a decision. Reviewers only can recommend a decision type, but the editors are the ones who make a decision. That can be accept, which rarely happens. It can be revised, major or minor, and it can be reject. And this is one of those condescending comments I share with you. I'm afraid this manuscript may contribute not so much towards the field's advancement as much as towards its eventual demise. So let's see, as a reviewer, you get an invite. What's next? If you want to be a good reviewer, check for your availability. If you don't have the time, reach out to the editor, ask if it is appropriate to extend the deadline. If not, make sure that when you decline, you suggest someone who can review. Make sure you also share any competing or conflicting of interest. For example, do you have any publication history with the authors, recent past, like past 3 years? Do you work in the same institute with the authors, any of the authors? Do you have any personal relationship? Or do you have any direct competing with any of the authors? These are all items that editors need to know, and they might not be able to find out using tools like existing databases. If you decide to accept, make sure that you read all the instructions and journal-specific requirements and keep the manuscript and your review confidential until the manuscript gets a final decision. If you decide to decline, as I mentioned, make sure you provide a reason that is justifiable, you make a suitable candidate suggestion, and then still keep the manuscript confidential, because it's going to be quite some time before it gets published. Now, make sure if you agree to review, you stay professional and courteous. Whatever you write is going to land on author's desk, who have spent a huge amount of time and effort to write that paper, and they require some courteous feedback. Be objective and constructive and specific. Before starting to write your comments, read the whole paper, and make sure you read the appendices as well. Follow the journal's guidelines and be consistent with your confidential comment to author. Remember that the purpose, again, is to assist authors in improving their paper. So it's quite clear what you should not do. You should not write anything that you would not be happy to receive yourself as an author. Don't suggest grammatical correction line by line. That's the copy editor's job nowadays. Generative AI can do it. Grammarly can do it. Do not ask authors to include references to your own work unless it is absolutely necessary. And do not request additional analysis, additional experiments, unless that is very essential to the claim that authors make in the manuscript. And then, keeping those in mind, you start to structure your reviewer comment to author. The first thing you do is to start your initial paragraph with a very high-level summary of your interpretation of the manuscript, not copy-paste of introduction of the manuscript or abstract of the manuscript. What do you understand from the paper? And also, what do you think are the strengths and limitations of the paper? Ask yourself, does the study add to the current knowledge? Does it challenge existing paradigms? Does it matter? And here is an example. The current study is on a topic of relevance and general interest to the readers of the journal. I found the paper to be overall well-written and felt confident that the authors performed careful and thorough field and spectral processing. The design of the field campaign combined with several micromet stations makes the dataset seem quite useful. However, the description of some very important points were inadequate or completely missing. I have very little confidence in one important analysis. And then you can go further and deeper into the points you want to make. Once you have that summary of your understanding and your concerns and praise for the strength of the study, start by your major comments. So what is it that fundamentally needs to change in order to make paper a better one? Start with the most concerning issue and work it down. For example, I have several significant concerns about the presentation and general results that should be addressed prior to publication. First, calibrate and validation of the employed models, and so on and so forth. Once you finish listing all the major concerns, you can start listing the minor comments. It can be that there are some confusing sentences or badly drawn figures or incorrect references or technical clarifications. An example can be in line 352, please add the range of estimation uncertainty to the trend. Another way of compiling your reviewer comments is to go section by section. In general, you have to go section by section. If there is anything major or minor, you refer to sections. But you can also, after summarizing your comment, instead of listing your major and minor concerns, list per section your major and minor concern. So starting from introduction, is the research question clearly stated? Is a coherent case made for why the research question is important? Are the most relevant pieces of previous work cited? Is the structure of the paper outlined in the introduction? And here is an example. In introduction part, author should give some clear significance of paper. The paper should not be a long story, but give clear insights on the research problem and how author has addressed this problem. The plan of study is missing in the introduction. The author should give the plan of study at the end of introduction. Then on the method section, you have to ask yourself the question, have the methods been described clearly enough to allow others to repeat them? Are they the most appropriate way to answer the research question, which was clearly indicated in introduction? And if there are samples of human or animals involved, are the ethical approval reports included? Has there been any necessary information along with the manuscript that you need to check? Is the sex and gender of the samples properly reported? And here is an example. Limitation of the study's methods. A weakness in the methods used in this study is that it does not reflect this common practice in its methods. Instead, the study had the participants independently rate the exercises and only then discuss reconcile. The method used in real life would be expected to improve the agreement level across reviewers, as well as reducing the difficulty of the task as compared to the methods used in the study, and then elaborating further. In the results section, ask yourself, are the results reported for all experiment analysis described in the method? Are the results reported for which methods have not been described? And this happens because the version of the manuscript at your hand is like version 22nd that the authors created after revising among themselves, reading and criticizing their paper. And it can be that they missed some extra sentences in the results where it was initially implemented in the methods, for example. So ask yourself, are they presented clearly and consistently, all the results? Do the figures and text match up? And here is an example of a reviewer comment. Older patients more likely than siblings to repeat a grade. I question whether the overall comparison of 33% for patients is the appropriate comparison to sibling group. In order to address treatment effects, I would think the appropriate sibling comparison would be 2 grades repeated post-therapy only. Additionally, when reporting differences by age, need to know more about ages of siblings. In the discussion section, ask yourself, does the interpretation reasonably reflect the results, or have the authors gone beyond the data? It happens a lot that we as authors try to see the best in what we have achieved and somehow spin it towards what we want to see, which is not nearly what the data shows. Are the potential limitations presented? In many disciplines, we are not used to clearly identify the limitations, and this is the reviewer role to make sure that they are clearly pointed out. Do the results conflict with those of other researchers, and have potential explanations been proposed? Has the research question been answered, the one that was presented in the introduction? Have the authors summed up what the findings mean in the grand scheme of things? What is the next step for future studies? And here is an example. Does your data support your conclusion that the transected end of the pancreas should be closed with interrupted sutures and reinforced with omentum when there was a significant leak rate and there was not comparison data with other techniques? The title and abstract are also part of the paper. There was a question from the previous section about how a good title should look like. Now, thinking as a reviewer, here are some tips. Make sure that you have a title that accurately reflects the research question and the study type. For example, if it is a systematic review, that should be part of your title, systematic review on something. Does the abstract contain the aim of the study and the most important methodological details, or is it just a copy of bits and pieces of the introduction? Are the findings reported in the abstract a faithful representation of those reported in the main text? And is anything presented in the summary that wasn't described in the main paper? Again, it happens because the version you see of a manuscript is not the first time that authors read and change. And it can be that the summary and the abstract has not been changed according to all the changes that authors made in the last version that they submitted, the body of the text. Ask yourself, is the conclusion justified by the data presented in the abstract? And are the implications for future work stated in the abstract? Title and abstract are basically the visiting card of the papers. It is the one and only part of the manuscript that is publicly, openly available. And that is the part of the manuscript that makes a person to read, go through the entire paper, or just pass through the next paper. So it is very important to make sure that these items are being addressed in your review comments. Authors appreciate that. And here is a reviewer comment about title. The title is not adequate. Oh, sorry, there are so many Zoom items here in my screen, I can't read it. The title is not adequate for an academic paper. The authors should revise it to make the title more comprehensive and interesting for readers, and then follow up with suggestions. Here is a comment about the abstract. The abstract is lacking the information about the methodology and unable to provide the brief implications of the analysis. Your recommendation type. When you finalize your comments based on all the tips and tricks that I mentioned in the previous slides, you also are usually offered to choose a recommendation type, which can be accept, reject, minor, or major revision. If you choose the recommendation type accept, it means very rarely happens that there is nothing that this manuscript could benefit from improving. But still, make sure that if that is your choice, there is a good argument for you to recommend that. And then reject is another decision recommendation that you can make. It is based on major flaws identified, for example, just by skim reading. And make sure that if you choose reject, you provide good arguments for your recommendation. For minor revision, you basically choose this top reviewer comment recommendation if you would not want to see the revised manuscript again for a re-review. It provides arguments for your recommendation that matches your recommendation. Make sure you suggest how authors can address your comments, and make sure that you can distinguish between mandatory and non-mandatory comments. These are the things that you really want to see in the paper to be improved, and there are some optional suggestions that authors might or might not want to implement. Number your comments and refer to pages, sections, lines, so that everyone, including the authors and editors, can easily find which item you're referring to. And if you choose major revision, it means that you are requested to re-review the revised version of the manuscript, because you have asked authors to do major changes in the manuscript, and it would be unfair and irrational for a reviewer not to want to re-review the revised version. Make sure, again, you number your comments, you provide arguments for your recommendations, and you suggest how authors can address those comments and suggestions. And again, distinguish between mandatory and non-mandatory comments. At any rate, the final decision is the editor's. You make recommendations, but it can happen that the editor recommendation at the end, the decision that the editor makes, is not aligned with your recommendation, because the editor sees other reviewer comments and they also have their own judgments. So do not get upset if you see the manuscript gets a decision different from what you recommended. And usually the editors notify reviewers about their decisions. Now, this is the last slide. I would like to invite you all to participate in a few events. One of them is Peer Review Week, happening every third week of the September every year. Across the globe, it's not an in-person event. It can happen that some institutions or journal publishers or societies organize in-person events, but in general, it's a virtual 1 week of celebrating the importance of peer review in the scholarly publishing. And if you happen to have a journal, make sure that at least you write up an editorial about the theme. Every year it has its own theme. More information about the Peer Review Week is also provided in the slides. I would also like to invite you to join EASE Ukrainian chapter. EASE is a European Association for Science Editors. It's a non-for-profit organization, and I am honored to be their vice president. We have chapters across the globe, and usually these are scientific editors of journals in that region who get together and make sure that they use all kind of resources available through ease for them. And with that, I would like to thank you and, if possible, answer your questions.